Stuart is the John Norris McGuire Professor of Information Technologies at the MIT Sloan School. He holds a PhD in computer science from MIT and has been an MIT faculty member since 1972. He served as the head of MIT Sloan Information Technology Group, consistently rated #1 in the nation for over 20 years. And he is currently the director of CAMS, as I said, Cybersecurity at MIT Sloan. Please join me in welcoming Stuart Madnick.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you're able to hear me okay. And as Alan mentioned, it's great to meet you, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to do it in person due to a unfortunate, unexpected medical surgery in my family. I'm not able to travel back to Cambridge in time. But I wanted to allow myself to interact with you. So during the session, and this is where Carrie Person will be helping me, I do want to pose some questions to the audience, and she'll help me to understand what some of the answers are. So all of us are concerned. One of the key themes in the symposium is the issue of resilience. How do we deal with events that happen to us often unexpectedly? And we have a model that we've used, and I welcome many of you to look at the MIT Sloan Management Review issue in January of 2023. We called it an action plan for cyber resilience. I'm not going to go through this entire plan. It would take us probably most of the rest of the day. What I want to do today is focus on this first step we call anticipation. And I think this is critically important because one of the things we have learned in a lot of our research, most things are not surprises. In other words, they're not usually the first time it's ever happened. And a lot of time we ignore all the evidence leading up to it. In fact, most cyber attacks, which I'll be talking about, there were warning signs ahead of time that were ignored. So I'm going to talk about the role of the CIO in anticipating things. And I don't want us to fall into I don't know how many of you remember this, but about a year and a half or so ago, Colonial Pipeline was hit with a massive cyber attack that resulted in the shutdown of about 50% of all the fuel for the East Coast of the United States. You don't want to be in the situation of the testimony before Congress of some of the top executives of Colonial Pipeline. I'm more or less paraphrasing what he said was, we never anticipated the possibility that we would ever be the target of a ransomware attack. I'm not sure what that guy is today, but you don't want to be in that situation. You want to know what are things you need to anticipate with due diligence. So I'm going to go through a number of possibilities, but the one I want to focus on is looking at what are some of the likely unrealized or unexpected aspects that many of us have been ignoring and can't ignore anymore. Just to put things in context very, very quickly, cybercrime, we've been studying this, the group we have here, Cybersecurity at MIT Sloan, and Carrie Person, our executive director, will be leading the panel next. But we've been doing this for about a decade, year on year. Despite all the efforts all of us have put in, the number, the quantity, the impact of cyber crimes have been increasing. Just from 2022 to 2023, there was about a 20% increase in data breaches. And although many of us here are from the United States, it's often real important to realize this is going on around the world, even though the news tends to be somewhat US focused. For example, in the Middle East, ransomware activity increased by over 77% in the past year. And by various estimates, the global impact of cybercrime exceeds $6 trillion in 2021 and expected to reach over $10 trillion by 2025. So we're going to talk about what are some of the things we can do about that. Now, as I said, cyber attacks are in the news all the time. I've already alluded to Colonial Pipeline, as well as the televised testimony by the various executives to the US Congress. When you get this much visibility, governments feel a need to do something. And what is the something that governments typically do? Well, government bureaucrats do not typically write cryptographic codes or firewalls and so on. What they do, they enact regulations. So let's talk about how many new regulations are you aware of? I'd like to have a bit of audience participation. This is where I'm going to ask my colleague, Kerry Perlson, to tell me what happens. I'd like to have a show of hands. I have 3 questions. How many of you are aware of at least 5 cybersecurity regulations that are affecting CIOs? Please put your hand up. How many of you are aware of at least 5 regulations? Kerry, how many do you
So
see?
I see about a dozen hands.
A dozen. How many of you are aware of at least 10 regulations that affect cybersecurity and affect CIOs?
I see less hands, about 2
Finally,
or 3.
how many of you are aware of at least 25 regulations? Any
I
hands?
think you topped it, Stuart. No
Okay.
hands.
The reason why I tell this is it turns out these regulations and legislations are coming from everywhere, from the White House, from Congress, from almost every 3-letter agency you can throw at it, some which have 4 letters in it. But it's not only at the government, federal level. At least 36 state governments have enacted their own regulations. And this is going on around the world, in the European Union, in India, China, Russia, you name it. In the research we're doing here at MIT, we are studying over 170 new cybersecurity related regulations that impact all aspects of the IT in your organization. So that's good news is I'm not going to cover all 170 of them, but I want to give you a little idea of what is going on out there. What we have done, we've taken those 170 regulations, and most regulations have multiple facets to them. We call these things facets, features, components. So we kind of assembled, if you will, all those various regulations and identified about 18 things they consist of. Let me just throw one of them out, that I was not aware of, some reason that it's not doing what I wanted to here. The one here that says cybersecurity whistleblower protection regulations. How many were aware of that? I wasn't aware of it until our researchers and our team discovered it. The idea here is very simple. If you are an employee within a company, such as an employee within your company, and the employee realizes that your company is doing things that are hazardous, dangerous, risky regarding cybersecurity, they can blow the whistle on you that you have violated any one of these 170 regulations. You will be fined, and the whistleblower will get a reward for that. That was something I wasn't aware of. Once again, just breaking down the 170 into these 18 categories, once again, would take far too much time. But just to give you a flavor of what's going on, I'm just going to look at the 5 that are on the screen over here. These are the required software bill of materials, required security by design, prohibiting payment of ransomware, a whole bunch of issues regarding data governance, which is a key issue for CIOs, and of course, required incident reporting. Let me go through each of these very briefly, just to give you a flavor of what's going on for those who may not be aware of them, and for those who are at least aware of them, maybe give you a little bit more insight of some issues that maybe you're not fully aware of. Let me take the first one, software bill of materials. Now, once again, I'm not sure that phrase rings a bell for everybody. Many of you, particularly those in manufacturing, are familiar with bill of materials. That is the list of components that go into a given product, such as your car. Your car can be decomposed into the engine, into the seats, into the hood, and so on. But each of those components can be further subdivided. The engine can be divided into the pistons and so on. So this is the multi-layer makeup of a car. Well, the same thing is true of your software environment. I don't know how many of you remember this a few years back, when the issue of the Log4j vulnerability was discovered. Many companies didn't know they had it because they personally had never acquired the Log4j, which is an open source piece of software. They had not personally acquired it. What they had acquired was the accounting system, for example. And they didn't realize the developers of those accounting systems had in fact installed Log4j as part of its components. So therefore, when the alert went out that watch out for this vulnerability, they didn't know they had it. They had to go decipher the breakdown of all the software in the system to find out if Log4j was buried, deeply embedded in the various layers of software. So this issue of keeping track of the multiple layers of software in the system can be a time-consuming and challenging chore. But it's not a matter of it being a good idea to do. There are regulations say you must do this or you may suffer various penalties. Let me give you an example. As I said, we're looking at over 170 regulations. I'm just going to give you a few flavors of the kind of regulations. For example, the National Institute of Standards and Technology issued a guidance that makes it mandatory for all vendors supplying software to federal agencies to maintain a software bill of materials. And the 2023 National Defense Authorization Acts require businesses working with Department of Defense or Department of Energy to provide a SBOM, a software bill of materials. Now, although I'll talk a lot about the United States, these things are going on around the world. And just to give you some flavor of it, I'll also give you some examples from Europe and the United Kingdom, which is sometimes part of Europe and maybe sometimes not. But the Cybersecurity Act requires organizations to maintain an SBOM to have a software bill of materials, as well as in the United Kingdom, software essentials scheme. So these things are going on around the world. So let me ask you a question. Can I have a show of hands and maybe Kerry help me? How many of you in your company maintain a comprehensive software bill of materials?
I'm seeing about a dozen, maybe 20
Okay.
hands.
So once again, this is something you need to look into. A, as to whether it's a good thing to do just for your own purposes, but more importantly, whether there was a regulation either already imposed that you may not be aware of, or a regulation coming down the track that you're going to need to respond to. So my goal today was kind of alert you to, I'll call them risks or issues that may not always be on your radar because they're fairly recent. That's on the SBOM side. Another one here is the issue of required security by design. Now, what do I mean by security by design? I remember, this must have been probably well over 10 years ago, maybe almost 15 years ago. I was on sabbatical in the University of Nice in France, which is a beautiful place to be. 1 second. And the group I was involved in was closely affiliated with another research group called the Automotive Telemetrics Group. And they were basically developing all kinds of new technology. Because this is 15 years ago, we weren't talking about autonomous vehicles, but talk about more electronics and more computer systems in the car. And the thing I observed in talking with them was they had many, many things. They had major challenges involved. They had to develop technologies that were relatively low cost, but at the same time operated in a hostile environment in terms of a hot engine in a car and so on. And I talked to them about cybersecurity, and they said, oh, we understand that's very, very important, but we've got some really, really hot problems we have to address. And we'll get around to dealing with security after we've solved all the other really hard problems. Then that was 15 years ago. I visited a company just a few years ago in Singapore doing much more advanced technologies for cars. I heard almost the same conversation. So there was a tendency to say, I got some really hard problems to solve. Cybersecurity, I know it's important, but I'll get around to it later on. I'll add it on, I'll tack it on. Well, tacking it on after the fact is not always easy to do. In some cases, it almost requires you to disassemble and redesign the entire product. So software security by design means at step one, as you're starting the design process, you start to address cybersecurity. It's built in from the beginning rather than tacked on at the end. Now, that involves a whole different way of whether you think about building a car or whether you think about building a software system in your company. So it requires a very different mindset, which is a big challenge for organizations that have not been operating that way. And once again, this is a relatively new concept, but not all that. In the United States, one of the first movements in this direction was in California in their Internet of Things or IoT Act that took place in 2020, requiring manufacturers of connected devices to incorporate from the beginning reasonable security features. This has gotten even maybe much more focused in Europe, where there are various things like the Network and Information Security Directive requires organizations to adhere to security by design principles, etc. So these are a new set of regulations coming your way or being enforced in some cases. Let me go on to the third one. This is kind of a fascinating one if you think about it. I won't ask the somewhat embarrassing question as to how many of you have suffered or experienced a ransomware attack, because they are everywhere. And of course, many organizations prefer not to make a lot of visibility about it. But one of the issues regarding ransomware, if you talk to various legal officials and such, they'll say, of course, paying a ransom just encourages more ransomers to attack either you again or attack somebody else. So if nobody ever paid a ransom, you remember what ransomware is, of course, where hackers get into your computer, lock it up many ways so you can't actually access your system. But more importantly, often they will cryptographically scramble all of your data files. So though the files may still be there, they're unreadable by you. So essentially the data is being locked up as well as your computer. And if you pay them the ransom, they will give you the cryptographic code or the key, if you will, to unlock it. And the idea being, if no company ever paid this ransom, then ransomwares will say, well, there's no benefit in doing it. So there's been an issue around the world for governments to say, if companies don't pay the ransom, there'll be much less ransomware attack. On the other hand, the question is, if you are attacked and your data is locked up, that poses serious challenges too. And there are regulations both at the state level, such as North Carolina was the first to prohibit public entities from paying a ransom. And there are various acts, such as the Ransomware Act of 2021, that would prohibit financial institutions from paying a ransom if it's over $100,000. And likewise, there are similar ones in Europe as well. So this is another issue. I don't know how many of you have thought about the issue of ransom. I don't know how many of you have a corporate policy. Some companies have policy, we will never pay the ransom. That can be very expensive in some cases. Some companies have a situation where they negotiate with their insurance companies. It's where the insurance will cover it up, et cetera, et cetera. But the issue of what is your corporate policy, number one, but also how does your corporate policy relate to the various regulations out there? Now, an important topic that all of you are involved in is data governance. And data governance is kind of a huge area of things. And of course, one of the things we concern ourselves about is exactly what are the rules we have for what data do we gather, how long do we keep the data, who do we share our data with, how is our data protected. There's a whole range of issues in the area of data governance, because basically if you think of it, data by and large is the major asset of our century. And so how do we safeguard that asset is an important issue in every company. And once again, there are regulations both in the United States at both the federal level and at the state level, and various regulations around the world, including over in Europe and such as the European Data Government Act. Now, the last one I'm going to talk about, and these are only 5 out of about 18 categories of things for which there are regulations about, is the issue I call required incident reporting. That is, if you experience, I didn't ask for a show of hands, but if you have not experienced a cyber attack, you're among the lucky few, because it's almost ubiquitous. Company after company after company hits cyber attacks, not just Colonial Pipeline. So the question is, though, you may suffer a cyber attack, but until recently, there was no requirement for you to tell anybody. There were a few occasions, such as if it involved the release of personal information, such as people's medical records or people's Social Security number, then there were certain regulations been around for quite a while that required you to report them. But if your company data is locked up or your inventory records are stolen, until recently, there were no regulations that required you to tell anybody about it. And in fact, there are many reasons why companies didn't. For example, the Colonial Pipeline, it turns out, had no legal requirement to report a breach. Now, you may remember Colonial Pipeline provided about 50% of all the fuel to East Coast of the United States. When tens of thousands of gasoline stations close down, it's kind of hard to keep it secret. So sometimes these things just leak out on their own. But in fact, as you know, most lawyers and insurance companies tell you, say nothing. But of course, if we don't know what's going on, if you don't know your neighbor that's down the street suffered a cyber attack, and you may be the next one on the list, you're not going to be very well prepared. So there's lots of reasons to want to have companies tell you what's going on. And there are various regulations, both in the United States, that require, for example, organizations that control critical infrastructure, such as energy and telecommunications, as well as the one that probably all of you should know, because it's gotten a lot of visibility fairly recently, was the Securities Exchange Commissions, or SEC, requiring companies to report instances within 4 business days after they're discovered. But there is a caveat that is only if it's a material impact. And once again, how material impact is defined as being negotiated, if you will, as we speak. So these things are emerging, some of which are well in place, some which are going through enactment, some which are enacted, but exactly how they're going to be enforced is up for grabs. And once again, there are similar rules in Europe, as well as in Asia, as well as in Australia, as well as in South America, as well as in Africa, all around the world, these regulations. Now, I call these things components, if you will, because it turns, let me say a quick thing regarding required incident reporting. This is a very active area of regulation for many reasons, because there's a lot we don't know. A lot of the focus, as I mentioned earlier, was about privacy. If private data was exposed, any other data, nobody really cared about it. And that's why I mentioned Colonial Pipeline was not required to report that. So here's a quick question of you. I want to show of hands. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. How many of you believe that at least 25% of all cyber attacks are publicly reported? Kerry, how many hands?
I see 2.
2. Okay. I was going to go down and ask how many think it's 10% or less, or 1% or less.
Well, when you say
I've done this.
1%, you've got about a third to 25 to 30% of the audience.
Exactly. So I've been at conferences this year with anywhere from 50 to 100 people, mostly people in the cybersecurity area. So these are kind of their main area. And the vast majority of them say they think it's under 1%. We don't know because we don't know what we don't know. But the feeling is there's a tremendous amount we don't know, which is why regulations requiring us to report them are so important. Okay. As I mentioned, lots of complexities involved. Finally, as I mentioned before, most like actual regulation is things that are enacted by regulators or by legislators and so on, usually do not focus on one single thing. For example, if you look up here, the one in the top of my list, the NISD2 addressed this issue, requiring incident reporting, required requires bill materials, and so on. So we'll see that many of these regulations cover multiple areas. And so that's why you need to be both aware of what the regulations are and what they cover. I've only really given you the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully these are things that maybe were not on your radar, or at least were not adequately on your radar. These are coming down the line, and the penalties, both publicly and financially, for violating these regulations can be substantial. And as I mentioned, we're tracking over 170 regulations. For those who have the time and interest, there's a number of articles we have written, both in the public press, Wall Street Journal, Harper's Review, as well as in various conference proceedings, talking about the regulations, what they are, what you have to do to address them, what are the concerns. I want to thank you all for listening to this. I hope this is something that is of interest to you, and hopefully you'll pass on the message to others in your organization. These regulations tend to be very sweeping in almost all part of the organization, but particularly the CIOs are impacted. Thank you very much, and have a great day today.
Is there time? Is there a question that somebody would like to ask Professor Madnick? Stuart, I think you covered it all. All right, let's see a show of hands. How many people now know at least 5 regulations in cybersecurity? All right, we got about 100% hands raised, Stuart. Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Have a great
good
day.
Progress. Thank you all. Have a great day. And I know Kerry Person will be going on discussing issues regarding cybersecurity and resilience that relates to a lot of topics here. Have a great day.